guys, it's Melissa and welcome back to our channel, Pineapple and Snowflakes. It's just going to be me today, and I just wanted to do a quick video going through all of the common abbreviations that you'll really see a lot when you are kind of going through infertility blogs and channels. And for me especially, I joined a couple of Facebook groups specifically for embryo donors and recipients to just have a community together and answer questions and things like that. And it took me weeks to figure out all of these different abbreviations. There's just so many of them, and people who are used to it just use them constantly in posts, and I just didn't know what was going on. I have my phone with me here today, and I'm just going to be going through a list of all of those. And if there are any that I didn't get to that you think should be added, go ahead and put them in the comments below and we can go over those as well. But these were the ones that I thought were the most common. So the first one is number DP, number DT, and that's kind of confusing, but basically what it means is the number of days post, the number of days old your embryo is, day transfer. I know that that's confusing. So it's, if I had a 5-day-old embryo, because you can freeze embryos on different days in the process, so it could be a 2 or 3-day-old embryo or a 6 or 7-day embryo. So probably the most common are 5-day-old blasts. So that would be, like if I was 12 days past my transfer, I would be 12 DP, 5 DT, because I am 12 days post 5-day transfer. That was the one that took me the longest to figure out. And yeah, it's just really helpful to know that when you're reading through some of these blogs, because it's just used all the time for people to describe how many days past their transfer and then how many days old their embryo is, which really helps people understand how far along you would be if you were already pregnant. So the next one is AF, which is just ant flow for your period. People use that a lot because you're constantly having to report cycle day 1. The next one is AH. This is assisted hatching. Assisted hatching is a technique not always used, but some, reproductive endocrinologists will kind of drill a little hole or kind of crack the shell of the embryo to help it hatch once it implants, because a hatching embryo is a little more likely to implant once they transfer it. BCP is just birth control pills. A lot of people have to take birth control to help them regulate their cycle before they go into a frozen embryo transfer cycle. Beta is another one, and a lot of you might already be familiar with that because it's just a pretty general term. It's the blood draw that you go in and get done that checks your pregnancy hormones, and that's how they tell you if you're pregnant and if in the early stages if your pregnancy is progressing like it should be. The next one is BF, and that's just breastfeed. Again, some of these are pretty intuitive, but when you're just seeing them all in a row or so constantly, it's hard to keep them straight. A BFN is a big fat negative, and unfortunately that is when you have an embryo transfer and it doesn't implant, and either you do a pregnancy test or go in for your beta blood draw and it's completely negative. That's what a BFN is. So conversely, a BFP is a big fat positive, and that is great news. That means that your pregnancy hormone is there and it's progressing like it should be. A blast is what they call a blastocyst, and that's the stage of your embryo. Typically around 5 or 6 days is when they reach blastocyst stage. DH, people use that all the time. It just means dear husband. DE is donor egg. So sometimes, even though you have embryos that you adopt or are donated from a couple, and they sometimes they have used an egg donor. So not only do you have donated embryos, but that couple used an egg donor or a sperm donor. So that's what the DE comes from. DD means double donor program, And we're going to talk a little bit more about the different types of embryo adoptions and donations in one of our next videos. But the double donor program is basically where they use an egg donor and a sperm donor. They fertilize those embryos and then they adopt out those embryos. So they haven't already been created for a couple. They're kind of created specifically for embryo donation. The next one is EA, that means embryo adoption, and ED, which means embryo donation. And those, again, we're going to get more into the distinction on those because they're used interchangeably for the same process, and they essentially mean the same thing. And we're going to be a pretty inclusive group here and be okay with it if people use whichever term, but there is a little bit of a difference there. So stay tuned for the next video where I'm going to talk about the different kinds of embryo adoption, and that'll help you kind of keep those a little straighter. EDA is embryo donation and adoption. You're probably going to see a lot of our videos with that in the title, and you're going to hear us refer to the process as EDA a lot. It's just all-encompassing of the entire process and all the different methods. Embryo, donation, and adoption. Embryo, adoption, and donation. Just EDA is the term that you use for that. ESET, that is an elective single embryo transfer. A lot of people decide to transfer 2 or more embryos in hopes that that will increase their odds of having a successful transfer. Statistically, it does not increase your odds that much, but some people just feel more comfortable that way, or they have multiple embryos frozen in a single straw. So they're just, more likely in that case to just transfer all of them rather than thaw them all and then refreeze 1 or 2. But when you just do a single embryo, which is what we did in our most recent transfer, if you just do a single embryo, that's the elective single embryo transfer. The next one is SMBC. That's another one that took me a while. Everybody uses it, and it's because it stands for single mother by choice. And embryo adoption is very popular for women who, are a lot of times are a little older and they really want to start their families, but they aren't married yet. And so they'll adopt embryos and start their family without having a spouse or a partner. And so that's what SMBC means. The next one, FWIW. You'll see it a lot. It's just for what it's worth because so many of these posts are asking for advice and things like that, and wanting others to share their experiences. So that's what that is. The next one is HCG. Earlier we talked about a beta, and when you go in to have a beta blood draw, what they're testing for is the HCG, and that's the human chorionic gonadotropin. I don't know. But that is the hormone that's secreted by a placenta once it's implanted and starts to grow. Typically when you go in, you want to see a number above 100, and that should pretty much double every 2 to 3 days as you go in. And so you'll have probably 2 to 3 blood tests before they'll even think about doing an ultrasound just to see if it's doubling. Because if it is, that usually means it's progressing well and everything's implanting and growing like it should. The next one is HPT. That's just home pregnancy tests. So any of those, tests that you take, pee on a stick, that's another one, POAS, pee on a stick, home pregnancy test, any of those that you can test your HCG levels yourself. IUI is an intrauterine insemination. It's something that is less invasive than IVF. People do it a lot of times before they take that step just to see if it'll work. And that is really where you're doing a timed cycle, and they inject the sperm through your cervix at the time that you are supposed to be receptive, to hopefully increase your odds of getting pregnant without an IVF cycle. The next one is MF, that's male factor infertility. You know, all of these infertility problems can be caused by female factor or male factor, or sometimes both. In our case, it's only female factor. It's just me. We have no male factor infertility issues. And we'll get into that too. A lot of people will wonder, well, if that's the case, why didn't you just do an egg donor? So that's a future video. PGS testing is pre-implantation genetic screening. And this is where they take the embryos and they test them for any genetic abnormalities. A lot of times, you know, most embryos and most humans are going to have some kind of genetic issue. And that test is just looking for any that aren't compatible with life, because then you won't bother transferring that embryo if there's no way that, you know, it could take an implant. PGD is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, and that's where they're looking for specific genetic conditions. And then they can also use that one to test the gender. So you actually, it is possible to know what gender the embryos you're transferring are. So if, you know, some people, if they have several boys and they really want a daughter or vice versa, and they'll look to embryo adoption to try to kind of make sure that they have a daughter. So that is possible. None of ours are PGS tested. We don't know any of the genders or genetic conditions, or if they're normal or abnormal. You know, that's another pretty big expense, and we just decided it wasn't worth it at that point. PIO is progesterone in oil, the dreaded injections that you have to do. They're intramuscular. It's a needle like that long. It's terrible, in my opinion. It's just kind of the worst part of a embryo cycle. Not looking forward to doing that again, but that's what that stands for. The oil is usually sesame oil, but it can also be like olive oil or ethyl oleate, things like that. We've already talked about POAS, or POAS, pee on a stick. Pupo is the next one. It sounds hilarious, but it means pregnant until proven otherwise. After you've had your embryo transfer, but before you can do your beta blood draw, typically you call that Pupo, because you're pregnant. There's an embryo in there. You're hoping it implants, and that's kind of the most exciting part right after a transfer, is just, you know, no matter what happens from this point on, I right now am pregnant. It's super exciting for us. It was the first time in my entire life. I'm 30, and it's the first time I could ever say that I was pregnant, and it was just really a fun and joyful time. So that's what Pupo means. It's really a funnier word than the situation merits, but, you know, why not bring a little levity into it? The next one is RE. That's a reproductive endocrinologist. Those are the doctors that help you. They do your IVF cycles, your frozen embryo transfers, and that's who you'll go see at a clinic when you go. The next one is a singleton. That is anytime you are transferring one embryo, or if you're only pregnant with one embryo, that's a singleton. A lot of people, again, do multiples, and so that's the term they use when people know you just have the one. A transfer. This is a really big hot button issue. A lot of people say, oh, when are you going to implant an embryo? You can't implant an embryo. You cannot make them implant. I wish very much that you could. There are things you could do to increase your odds, but what they're called is an embryo transfer, a frozen embryo transfer, FET. And that's just because the best they can do is, thaw the frozen embryo. They put it in a catheter, through your cervix, and they put it directly in the best spot with the thickest lining in your uterus. And from there, it's just all chance. So you'll always hear us say transfer. We will never say we're going in for an embryo implant. I wish that were possible, but it's just not. TTC, trying to conceive. Anybody who has ever even had to track their ovulation, had some trouble getting pregnant as quickly as they wanted to, they're TTC, trying to conceive, but it's also used for people doing IVF and people doing embryo donation and adoption. Last two, home stretch here, so just hang in there. U/S, that's an ultrasound. You have to do a lot of ultrasounds before you can actually do your transfer, because they have to check and make sure that your lining is getting thick enough. They're making sure that you don't have any growths. When I went in for my first embryo transfer and they did an ultrasound, I found out that I had just some kind of, I don't even know, it was like a fibrous material that they wanted to go in and scrape out before they did the frozen embryo transfer. So yeah, just a lot of ultrasounds involved. And then the last one is the 2WW or TWW. That's the 2-week wait, the dreaded 2-week wait. It's terrible. You go in for your transfer, you're so excited, you're Pupo, and you just have to wait and hope that you're pregnant, and every little twinge and hot flash and any nausea, you're just symptom spotting and hoping and wondering if that's a good sign or a bad sign. So yeah, those are not even all of the terms. I got as many as I could in there, or the ones I thought that you'd need, but I hope you see now that it really is just a huge community of people, and it really has its own language, and it's so confusing. So this is just a video that I'm hoping will help save some people the headache of reading through blog post after blog post and Facebook post after Facebook post and just wondering, what the heck am I reading right now? So I hope you found that helpful, and just tune in for our next video. Click like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. I know that was a lot of information. Thanks for hanging in there, and I hope you learned something, and we will see you next time.